Antony Groves-Raines was born in County Down in Ireland, more than likely in 1913, although some quote other years. Although it's recorded that he actually acquired a degree in an unknown subject from Cambridge University with the intention of a career in the diplomatic service, I can find no record of when or where, if anywhere, he studied art. The earliest dated example of his work I could find was a watercolour cover for the Guinness scrapbook published in 1937, when he would have been 24 if his date of birth really was 1913. The company were impressed enough with his work to offer a more substantial commission in the following year. This was Alice Aforethought, which took the characters and situations from Lewis Carroll's stories, originally illustrated by John Tenniel in 1865. And although Groves-Raines' versions were recognisable as the same characters, he added touches of his own and reimagined them in colour, set against a Guinness-theme absurdist narrative. It was published as part of what was and is still known in advertising circles as a below-the-line campaign, meaning that it's not aimed at the general public like a press ad or poster. In this instance, the intended audience was the medical profession, and their purpose was to persuade doctors to encourage patients to drink Guinness for its health benefits, incredible as that now seems. In 1939 he created a distinctive whimsical poster for London Transport featuring the Roman excavation and museum in the town of St Albans. And in the same year he produced a similarly light-hearted nursery rhyme themed colour cover for the Christmas edition of the London News. 1939 saw the publication of another promotional book titled Prodigies and Prodigals. This was another commission which clearly demonstrated Groves-Raines' talent for creating frivolous and highly attractive pen and watercolour work. And he rose to the challenge with a series of highly idiosyncratic, amusing illustrations with a strong flavour of late Victorian and Edwardian Britain. But 1939 was also the year in which Britain declared war on Germany, and it's quite likely that he would have served in the military, although like the rest of his life nothing is actually recorded. But whatever the case, it wasn't until 1948 that any more evidence of his work appeared. This was another Guinness ad campaign, but this one actually ran in various popular British magazines. And for the first time, Groves-Raines' work for the company was actually aimed at the general public. This series of memorable and charmingly strange images was once again entirely Alice-themed, and made the perfect visualisation of the light tone of the text, which parodied Lewis Carroll's written style while singing the product's praises. A year later, Groves-Raines created this double-page spread about the life of Sir Francis Drake for a children's history book, and in 1950 he illustrated an edition of Hans Andersen's fairy tales. It featured only a handful of vignetted colour pages, but they were exquisitely detailed and rendered, and illustrated the various tales with wit and visual eloquence. There were also some line-only spot illustrations, of which I've only managed to find these two examples. But it was the atmospheric and occasionally unsettling colour pages which resonated with a certain medieval appeal and demanded the reader's attention. In a burst of greater than usual productivity, in the same year his visualisation of 1001 Arabian Nights was also published. And although there was a deliberately Orientalist influence in the composition and execution of this remarkably compelling series, they were far from slavish. As with the Andersen's tales, these more brightly coloured illustrations were highly successful evocations of the characters and locations which featured in the written narrative. And like the Andersen book, there were also pen and ink monochromes dotted throughout the book, which in this instance I found significantly more evidence of. And these simpler pen drawings were every bit as expressive and oriental in flavour as the colour work. 1950 also saw a return to work for Guinness and their below-the-line advertising with the booklet titled Sportfolio. It features 6 double-page spreads detailing all manner of sports and outside activities typical of British life, or at least a highly comical and nostalgic vision of it on a month-by-month basis. Once more the text was written in verse, and Groves-Raines' delightfully captivating watercolours were vignetted and arranged around them to create a thoroughly entertaining visual experience. I have no idea how successful it was in its mission to persuade, but this was one of Groves-Raines' most visually satisfying and entertaining creations. In 1952 he was commissioned to create yet another Alice-themed book for Guinness. This was a celebration of Guinness's 200th anniversary, titled Alice, Where Art Thou? And it contained a series of dazzlingly imaginative pages featuring various characters from Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, all rendered with the greatest care. And in addition to the sheer aesthetic desirability of the illustrations, there were also plenty of pieces of visual trickery involving front and rear views of some of the pages to add to the broad appeal of this absurd, light-hearted and unforgettable marketing publication. To commemorate the 1953 coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, a booklet titled Came the Fair Young Queen was published, featuring some remarkably detailed and finely painted images from Groves-Raines, each of which inventively illuminated a different aspect of British society and culture to celebrate the advent of the new monarch. This full-page story illustration for Woman's Own magazine was also published in the same year, but if there are others, I haven't managed to track them down. What Will They Think Of Next was published in 1954 and distributed among the medical profession for Christmas. And this series of witty verses and cheerfully absurd colour pages was yet another clear demonstration not only of his aesthetic and technical prowess, but also his ability to translate not always straightforward prose and verse into visual language. This time around the theme was technological progress, and it comically combined more humorous verse with a series of illustrated scenes of British life and the supposed impact of technology on its citizens. The booklet was exceptionally playful and surreal in its content, and like all his work was presented on the page with great visual consideration. In 1956 another promotional book was published, this one titled Can This Be Beaten?, a punning reference to the famous Victorian cookery writer Mrs. Beeton. And the verses and images confined themselves to comedic takes on late Victorian life and domestic catering of the period. Following this attractive and amusing commission, I found no more evidence of his work until 1959, and the book On Christmas Day in the Morning. This was a collection of carols complete with lyrics and piano musical scores, and it was illustrated in both colour and red and black duotone. And although appropriately lacking in the absurdity of the Guinness work, his illustrations greatly enhanced the appeal of this volume of sheet music. In 1961, his own illustrated children's story The Tidy Hen was published, and as far as I can tell, this was the only example of him illustrating his own authored work. It was a light-hearted, inconsequential narrative with a series of endearing scenes involving the title character and others, both human and animal. And in addition to the typically well-rendered full-colour pages, there were also tonally rendered monochrome spot illustrations dotted throughout the book. Although the story and the illustrations were about as British as you could get, it appears to have only been published in the USA, and how well it fared there I have no idea. In that year he produced what appears to have been his last promotional work for Guinness, and for this the theme was the comic operatic work of Gilbert and Sullivan. Groves-Raines demonstrated every bit as much visual creativity and wit in these more than usually varied illustrations, and although it wasn't his last work, it made for a fitting epitaph for the remarkable body of images he had created for what had been virtually his sole client for just over 2 decades. The only later evidence of his work I've managed to find is this relatively lacklustre book cover illustration from 1964. And if the dates are correct, Antony Groves-Raines didn't die until 1993, by which time he would have been 80 years old. I think it's highly unlikely there would not have been more from such a talented and apparently productive illustrator. But the best I can do is to end with a small compilation of other images not used so far, and wonder how such a talented man could become so forgotten so quickly.